Hi, I'm Lorraine Torrence. I'm from Seattle, Washington. I'm a quilter and a wearable art maker, and I've been teaching quilting since 1972. That was the beginning of the quilt revival. But I arrived at this occupation quite by accident. I was a graduate student in sculpture, getting an MFA. I had to make a wedding present for someone in my department, but I didn't have any money. All of that was going into bronze and steel, but I had a scrap bag because I'd been sewing for years. So I sewed all my scraps together and made a crazy quilt. What I later became to understand was a crazy quilt, simply by sewing scraps together. I brought the quilt to my friend at the foundry, said, "Here's your wedding present." He took it home to his bride and came back the next day with a message from her. She said, "Hey, would you like to have a booth with me at the Pacific Northwest Arts and Crafts Fair this summer?" My response was, "Sure." So I started making quilts. That was the beginning of my career in quilt making. As soon as I graduated, I never made another piece of sculpture. It was all quilts after that. However, I loved clothes, and because I'd been making my own clothes since I was an adolescent, I very quickly started using quilting skills, piecing, applique, quilting, and most importantly, mixing different fabrics in my garments, which I hadn't done before, to make wearable art. That's my heartbeat now. I love clothing. And a friend of mine said recently, "I just hate to buy a book and only use one thing in it." I thought, that's a bright idea. How about making a one idea leaflet? So I started a series of leaflets called Bright Ideas for Wearables. The first one is Button Strategies. The second volume is Finishing Touches. The third volume is Thread Work. And the fourth is Bits and Pieces. All of these are ideas that I use in making my garment patterns, and I have two lines of garment patterns: Lorraine Torrence Designs and Grain Line Gear. Everyone always wants to know what the difference is. So here it is. Lorraine Torrence Designs are patterns that I designed. Grain Line Gear patterns are a pattern line that I bought from someone else in 2000. Since then, I've added 6 or 7 patterns to this line, all of them designed by other people to whom I pay royalties. So you will hear me talk about, this is a Lorraine Torrence Designs pattern, or this is a Grain Line Gear pattern, and that's what So what if you want to use a brooch or a fancy pin as a closure for your garment? I have examples of 2 of them here, and I think these are perfect closures for these garments. The one here on the table was made by Susan Gower of Nifty Thrifty Dry Goods. This is 3 or 4 antique buttons that were glued together and then made into a pin. So there's a pin closure on the bottom. Even though I think it's a perfect visual thing for this wool garment, you don't want to be pinning it, unpinning it, pinning it, unpinning it, because ultimately that's going to damage the fabric. So what I suggest, if you're going to use a pin to close a garment, is to keep the pin on the garment, and like this dichroic glass pin from Nancy Geddes, which is quite heavy actually, and this is on a tablecloth shirt made from an overdyed damask tablecloth. The dyeing was done by Wendy Richardson in the Minneapolis area. So to avoid pinning and unpinning, what I've done is to sew a snap there to keep it closed, so that this pin stays pinned all the time. This particular garment is finished by additional snaps. I didn't want to put any other buttons down the front, so I put snaps to finish the closure. So remember that suggestion for the real closure. This is the ornamental part of the closure, and a Velcro or a snap or hook and eye or something else on the back to keep it closed.